Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Coffee and Clarks. I'm Javian.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is going to be a part one of a two-part series on performance anxiety and a little bit of mental health and how to handle that. We're going to talk a little bit about how we've dealt with it in the past. So let's jump right into it. So, Tyler, what are you drinking today?
All right, so I still have the Costa Rica that I had on the first episode. I'm almost done with the bag now, but it's starting to lose a little bit of its flavor because it's been, I guess, a week and a half or so.
Yeah.
But I'm going to show off the Fox restaurant mug. This was a good place in Jacksonville, Florida, where I used to get breakfast occasionally.
Duval.
From back home. That's right. Represent. Go Jags. But yeah, so still the same bag as last time. I should be done with that in a few days and I'll have new updates. But what about you, man? What are you drinking on?
So like you, I'm also continuing to drink from the Perks coffee, the Kenyan blend. But you're witnessing this is the very last beans from the bag. So this will be my last of this particular brand of coffee. So our next episode, whenever we do that, I'm gonna have something fresh and new. So I'm excited. So I can tell like it's been, a week or 2 weeks. So you know the taste is not as flavorful as before, but it's still good stuff. So this is my last. I was kind of sad as I put this in my grinder, and I said, "This is it." Well, speaking of that, you mentioned, I think last time we talked, that you use a Chemex, or you said something about that.
Yeah, so I have a couple brewing methods. One of them was a V60, and that's what I used on the first episode. And then today I use the Chemex. So for Chemex, I like to use if my wife wants a pour over as well. So that's a little bit better for making more than just a cup of coffee. It's good for like 2 or 3 cups. So if you're sharing it with somebody, it's a little bit better. And again, I like those brewing methods because they're a little bit cleaner. So if you like flavor in your coffee and kind of finesse, so to speak, yeah, I would definitely recommend the V60 or the Chemex.
Nice.
And on that note too, didn't you get a new grinder like a couple weeks ago or a month
ago
or something like that?
I got a grinder late this summer. It's a Bodum grinder. It's electric grinder, and I like it, but I've been doing some experiment because there's not settings on there, like a setting for coarse or a setting for fine or somewhere in the middle. So it's a lot of kind of like trial and error. And so, you grind a little bit at a time. So I do it like, I'll count 2 or 3 seconds, and then I'll look at the beans and then grind it some more, kind of shake it up, try to get all the beans to kind of be evenly grind. But it's been working for me. But again, I've been doing some experimenting because there aren't any settings. So, but so far so good. I've been like watching videos and see if anybody has like recommendations on like how long to grind and all those different things. But I think I've kind of found a good system to make sure everything's kind of grinded, because obviously we're going for a more coarse grind. So we don't want to get it too fine. So that's why I'm trying to make sure, like, that's why I do like the intervals of 2, so that it doesn't become too fine. I kind of want it to be really coarse, a coarse grind. So that's what I do with my grinder. Sense. Yeah.
Yeah, because you do a lot of French press, right?
Yes, until I'm gonna try to get a new a Chemex or something so I can do my pour overs again.
That's right.
Maybe this weekend I'll see if I can find something. But yeah, I'll keep you updated on that, see how that goes.
Cool.
Yeah. So, performance anxiety.
Lovely topic, right?
Lovely
I'm already
topic.
Nervous.
Yeah.
My hands are already sweaty.
Yeah, I think, for musicians, and not just musicians, in many fields, I think every musician has either been affected by performance anxiety, or if you haven't, you probably will at some point in your playing career. Or if you're a student, you'll probably at some point experience some nerves or performance anxiety. So like how would you define like performance anxiety?
Uh, well, I think from like a technical, like textbook definition, I think it's like your body's natural response to stress. And a lot of it, I mean, it just depends individually too, like what stems that stress. You know, it can either be failure, you know, fear of failure, uncertain outcomes, things of that nature. And I think as performers, especially trumpet players too, we always wake up and wonder, like, do I have it today? Is my face going to be together today? You know, we become so like self-conscious about that, that it consumes your thoughts and your minds. So I think it is a natural thing. You know, if you're in traffic, like for instance, when I used to live in Atlanta and I'd have to drive through downtown, like that was anxiety, like driving through like rush hour traffic, because like cars are flying through like 8 lanes and this and that. You know, so it occurs in many different ways and manifests in many ways as well. So I think it's one, identifying like, okay, this is my body telling me that you're about to enter in, or you're entering into like a high stress situation for yourself. And then from there, I think it becomes you sitting down and figuring out, okay, why am I stressed out? Like what's triggering my mind to think like, oh my gosh, like you're starting to shake, your hands are getting sweaty. You know, you got dry mouth, things of that nature. I mean, what about you? Like, how do you, again, like we're not doctors, and actually on our part 2 we're going to bring a mental health professional on. So JV and I are basically speaking from the point of our perspective and what we've experienced. So again, when it comes to the textbook, we've looked up a little bit of definitions of it, and that's kind of, again, it's your body's natural response to stress. But so that's probably as far and as deep as we'll go on the medical side of it, again, because we are not doctors, so we don't want to put out false information. But Javian, as a professor and a performer, you know, what are your experiences with anxiety? Like, how do you deal with it, cope with it, teach it to students? You know, like if students are dealing with this, like, how do you say, okay, this is this, and it comes from this?
Yeah, it's a tough subject. As I said before, I think all musicians probably deal with it on some level, some more extreme and some not so much. For me personally, especially like I would say throughout high school and a good bit of college, performance anxiety was not something I really dealt with. There were a few occasions that I can still remember to this day where I had like almost a panic attack when I was about to perform or performing at the time. And it was such a rare occasion for me that when it happened, I was like, what is happening to me? You know, it just kind of like blindsided me. It's like getting punched in the face. It's like, what is this? What is my body doing? Um, but I think kind of like what you said, it kind of goes back to um, this idea of wanting, or at least for me, this idea of wanting the perfect performance, you know, and the amount of pressure, depending on the situation which we're performing. I think the amount of pressure that we put on ourselves, it creates that anxiety, and sometimes it manifests in physical ways like shaking, or you know, fast heartbeat, or sweating, or dry mouth, or anything like that. So like when my students, you know, I have them play in studio class often, or you know, do different performances to kind of recreate that scene of putting them on the spot. It's like, all right, we prepared this etude, for instance, now let's go perform it, and then just kind of see how they respond to it, and then we can have a conversation like what they felt, you know. And oftentimes what I've found is their anxiety comes from fear, the fear of not knowing what's going to happen when they play. Because I mean, and I completely understand that, because even though, you know, we do all this preparation, there is this small percentage where even through all this preparation, we still don't quite know what's going to happen. We think we know, we've done the work and all those different things, but there is this small things like what's actually going to happen. And I think, especially being like a brass player and a trumpet player, you know, we're dealing with these very small muscles in our lips here. So it's like, I hope I have a good chop day. So that brings another like element into it. It's like, when we're playing, we want it to feel right. We want it to feel a certain way when we're playing. And when it feels that way, it's like, all right, we're good. Like, it's, this performance can be fine. But to me, it's the days where it doesn't feel like, that perfect setup, like, when you're right in the groove and everything's working the
That
way you
sweet
want to work.
spot.
That sweet spot, exactly. And it's the
Yep.
performances, or when we have to perform when we're not feeling that sweet spot. That's when, especially when I have, and I've seen some of my students have that anxiety. It's like, I really don't know what's going to happen. Even though, again, you kind of have to trust the process. But I think, from my experience, performance anxiety comes from the fear of the unknown. Holding yourself to like this perfect expectation, like it has to be perfect, which then goes into a whole nother discussion about ego. I think a lot of that is ego, because I can tell you from personal experience. So like I said, when I was in school, I really didn't deal with a lot of anxiety, with just a few occasions. But I think now that I've gotten older, I deal with it more, because I think I feel that there's more at stake, which to me is somewhat ironic, because I'm in a job. I have a job. You would think that trying to get the job would have that, like, there's a lot at stake here. But I think now that I'm in a job, in a position that everything has to be perfect, there's this high level of perfection that you want. So you add that extra layer of pressure, which in my opinion, feeds performance anxiety. So, in the past, year or two, I found myself dealing with more like performance anxiety, and for me, I've been trying to figure out what helps me, alleviate some of the stress of a performance. But again, I think that does go to, this added layer of like striving for perfection, or, dealing with your own ego. You know, I think, whenever I have students and they're performing, I was like, everyone in this room is rooting for your success. This is not, a sports league where everyone's, people are rooting against you, rooting for you to miss the shot. No, everyone is like literally cheering for you. Everyone wants you to sound as well as you can possibly sound. So take that pressure off your shoulders and just play. At the end of the day, what we do, we have such a good gift, and that is creating music. It's an art form. And there's supposed to be this organic thing where when we're playing music and people are listening, it's supposed to be this great relationship between the audience and the performer. And I think sometimes we forget that. It's not supposed to be about the performer per se. It's always about the music, right? So, it's something I constantly tell myself, something I tell my students all the time. So like, try to take your own self out of the equation and just play. It's, at the end of the day, it is supposed to be fun, right? It's supposed to be an enjoyable experience. And I know sometimes, depending on whatever the situation, it's hard for us to realize that, especially if you're like auditioning, or you're doing like a recital for a job, or you're performing for a competition where there are physical things at stake. But at the end of the day, I think if you're programming ourselves, it's always about the music. It's supposed to be an enjoyable experience regardless of the outcome. Then I think that kind of helps alleviate that. But the performance anxiety is definitely a real thing, and it is something hard to deal with. And again, for different people, it's a very extreme thing. I think we both know stories of professional musicians who play in major symphonies who have had to take time away from their jobs and try to figure out how to deal with performance anxiety. So
Yeah, it's a real thing for sure. No, and everything you said was spot on, man. I think the thing that resonated with me was you said the ego.
yeah,
The ego, man, the silent killer. It's true though. I mean, it's most of the time it's these self-created fears and thoughts that we think in our minds, and then it, destroys us. It destroys our performance. Um, it's rough, and performance anxiety is something that I've been experiencing for since like middle school and high school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember middle school we'd have these scale tests and be like, why am I so nervous? And some of it was because I cared too much about it. And then in high school, kind of went away for a few years, and then I was dealing with a weird embouchure, like playing off to the side and into the red, and had a bunch of chop issues and stuff. And at the time too, I had a lot of obligations with the school that I went to, the high school. I went to a performing arts high school, and the demand for just like, we need it now, it destroyed me. It wrecked me. Like it made me a worse player. And it put me in a very, very bad mental state of just constantly being nervous. I remember we'd always have lunch before we go to band, and I could barely eat my food.
Wow.
And this was like in high school. And then of course, then it stems to college. And I remember in studio class just being a wreck, having to play. And especially when you're at a school that has, master's and doctoral students who are fine players, and then you have to go out and perform in front of them. And I mean, it was rough, man. And it started going away more once I got out of school and away from like that kind of environment, and started freelancing. And then it became more about the hang, and the gigs didn't have, like you said, pressure, so to speak. Like this, I don't know if the pressure was like in the room or if it was just like from within, but like when I was freelancing and stuff, it was like very rarely did I get nervous. It would only be if there was like a tune that they called that I didn't know, and I was like, okay. But then it'd go by, and it's whatever. And then at my master's, it got accelerated, but this is when I really tried to figure out how to manage it and how to kind of take control of it. Because I started learning more and more about like not self-help, but just ways of like fine-tuning your thinking. And so some of this now we'll kind of introduce, we can kind of talk about like how we can take control the best that we can. And some of this really is positive versus negative self-talk. The thoughts that you believe or the thoughts that you think. And I believe that 100%. If you're constantly saying like, man, I suck, or like you wake up and you're like, oh, I have a bad chop day, like, oh my God, this is going to be bad. Chances are it's going to be bad because you're thinking those things. But if you say, you know what, it ain't really happening right now, that's okay. It's all good. I'm going to trust that things will be there. I've done the work. I've done the preparation. Like that kind of alleviates stress. It's just like taking a breath in and then letting it out. It's like you're allowing yourself to like be okay with what's kind of happening. I don't know. Do you have some tips or advice or things that you've done personally to kind of work through? Because you said you had some moments where you almost had a panic attack. So I'm just curious to see, like, I know everybody some people have like their traditions or their routines before a big performance. Like, can you share some of that with us?
Yeah. I think whenever I'm having, or if I'm anticipating, like before the performance is where I feel the most anxiety. It's like that 20, 30 minutes before. And as it's getting closer, I feel it more. So for me, I've been a big believer in like meditating and breathing and just thinking positive thoughts and
So
oh, go ahead.
when you meditate, like what are you, like, are you sitting down? Like I want, like, explain it. Like what?
Yeah, so like when I'm meditating, and it's a combination meditation and breathing. Typically, I mean, if I can sit, I prefer to sit. So now I'll just sit there, and I'll just think about just beautiful thoughts. I'm just thinking about. Sometimes I'm just singing through the music that I'm about to play, just nice and easy, very like almost operatic in my head, and I'm just taking in deep breaths. I'm just thinking about the positive work that I've put in to get to the point that I'm at. And again, as I'm doing this, I'm just doing a lot of deep, slow breathing just to like slow the heart rate as much as possible. And I'm just thinking, I'm like basically, giving myself a million pats on the back, and I'm just thinking nothing but positive thoughts breathing, and I'm just doing that over and over just to kind of get any like negative thoughts out of my head, try to get my ego out of my head, just eliminate all the distractions and just focus on what I said earlier in terms of it's about the music, and I, constantly remind myself everyone in the room is cheering for you. Everyone wants to hear good music. Everyone, wants to, root for you. Everyone's here to be your support system. And I just say these things to myself over and over as I'm taking in deep breath, sitting down, trying to be as relaxed. I put the trumpet away, it's still in the case. And I'm just trying to focus on like finding my center. And then, after doing that for a few minutes, usually that does help a lot at least for me. So I just, for me, like I said earlier, I think it's about putting a lot of pressure on myself. So I'm trying to take that pressure off my shoulders and allow myself to be mortal and be a person rather than a machine who's like, it has to be perfect. And to me, I try to change that approach to like, it has to be musical. I think, and a lot of times, I think there's been some like research that I've seen where it's something I like to do is like, even when I'm performing, I think sometimes when we're playing something or a string player playing something, we get super focused on like, oh, there's that lick is coming up. That lick is coming up. Oh, it's a measure away, or it's like, it's at the start of the next page. And then we're like so far out of the moment, the musical moment, that we just get super focused on these one little things that we are anticipating before they happen. That's going to like trip us up. Right. So it eliminates all the musical presentation that we're trying to do. And we're just super focused on this one thing. Right. Which, in my opinion, causes a lot of anxiety, or distractions on the stage. And for me, I tried, rather than like super focusing on like one thing, or like I'm playing something, oh, my articulation is not happening right now. Or, oh, my range is not happening right now for this piece that I'm playing. In the moment of the performance, I try to think big picture all the time. It's like, oh, here's a phrase. Here's the next phrase. Oh, let me crescendo here. We're going to this line here. So I'm trying to change my mindset to be more about the overall musical presentation rather than like super focused on this one thing. If I've done the work, the preparation, it's all here. It's all under my fingers. So I need to put myself in the mind space where I'm thinking like big picture, where's this phrase going? Where's this movement going? Where's the climax of this movement or this section of the piece, So it eliminates a lot of the negative talk or the self-talk in the midst of the performance itself. So I found that to be very helpful for me. Do you have any things that you do to help alleviate your performance anxiety?
Yeah, for sure. Those are all really, really good points. So I think for me, it starts way before the performance and it comes from preparation.
Correct.
I think it starts from doing my homework and listening and figuring out, okay, what demands this piece or this recital or this concert has for me. And so then it's it's like, oh, I have to play like super soft on this one. So then I start thinking, okay, I need to incorporate this into my practicing. Or it's like, oh, there's a lot of multiple tonguing, so I need to practice a lot more multiple tonguing and all that kind of stuff. And, I'll go through and look at a piece and say, okay, well, here are the licks, here are the chunks that I'll work on, do slow practice, and kind of as soon as I can get those under my belt, the stress is kind of goes away, and I try to do that before the first rehearsal or things of that nature. So I think it starts with preparation, because once you have prepared and kind of dug as deep as you can with the pieces that you're performing, you start to feel more comfortable with it. The more listening that you do, and that's kind of to piggyback off of what you said, is like when you're in the moment actually performing, like you should know the piece so well that you're just like singing the melodies and singing the other parts in your head. And then therefore that will take your mind away from, oh, here comes that lick that I worked on for like a month. Instead of that, it'll be like, oh, here's this beautiful lick that I'm playing, or this phrase, or the cellist has this awesome part here. So that kind of helps. And I'm actually doing that more in my practicing right now, is a lot more singing, like off the horn. And then when I play, trying to emulate that. And I think that's what I did a lot for this Air Force audition that I won, was when I got into the room and performed, it was literally just like, all right, next excerpt, think about the tempo, think about the sound, context of where this excerpt fits into the piece, and then just singing it. And then having a short-term memory. So if something happens, it's gone, it's done. And I think that's what we have to remind ourselves, is like, you touched upon this too, is that you're making live music. There's a raw human element to that. This isn't like a studio recording where you're like, all right, stop, let's patch this one note, let's patch this 3 measures. All right, cool, moving on. It's got to be perfected. It's like, if you listen to people's like live recordings, I mean, there's amazing things going on, but there's still mess ups. Like, they're still missing things. And that's okay. That's what makes it human. You actually listen to it and you're like, okay. They deal with the same things I deal with too, but just less of it, Mm-hmm. So I think realizing that it's going to happen, like, you're not perfect, you're human, and just accepting that and saying, I'm going to prepare as best as I can. And where the chips fall, they fall and they land, and just being okay with that. Because again, it's about the overall process of like, minimizing the amount of, I don't want to say mistakes, but like, look, if you're in the 90 percentile of playing a piece and you're hung up on the 2% that you missed, it's like, okay, you got to let that go. Because probably most people won't realize the 2% that you missed. It's just yourself. That's why, like, they talk about like bad chop days, and it's like, maybe you notice, but the other guys at the section don't. Like, that's a good place to be in if your colleagues don't recognize that you're having a quote unquote rough chop day. So again, I think it starts with preparation. And then after the preparation, I do a lot of like the self-talk. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of like build myself up before the performance and just say, like, you got this, you've done the work, like, just have fun. I try to like think of positive thoughts, and then also visualization. So this is something that I got a lot from Dr. Moore, was like visualizing myself, like playing the best that I can, like playing those licks that I feared, but like playing them amazingly with like no tension, just with ease. And like what that visualization does is actually relaxes your body. And now you're saying, okay, this is what it looks like to do it correctly and how I want to, and in the environment that I want to. Now I just have to go and do it. I think visualization is huge and critical. And I use that a lot for the audition as well, doing mock auditions and, trying to create the environment. And like you said, you do that with your studio class, doing studio performances. I think that's crucial, because then all of a sudden that environment becomes normal. Like, you're used to sitting in an orchestra. It'll be interesting when everybody slowly makes their way back to doing gigs. Like, I'm sure everybody's anxieties kind of go up, because it's been a while since people are performed. And so they kind of lose that edge that they have of like, oh, I'm just constantly like performing. So I'm used to like being thrown in the ringer. And now it's like, hey, 6 months to a year off. And now you're like, wait, I got to kind of relearn how to perform again. Mm-hmm. So I think visualization helps. And then also, like you said, breathing exercises. Recently, I've gotten into the Wim Hof Method, and that might be a little intense before a performance, but I think doing some easy breathing, like you said, in and out, slow breaths, checking your heart rate, doing things of that nature will help a lot. I think also journaling too, just making sure that like whatever you're feeling, and you can do that post audition. I used to, during my auditions, I would journal and write down, like I would record all the rounds and then I would make notes. And it was good because it would allow me to say, okay, this is what I heard. This is how I felt. This is how I feel now. And it's interesting too, to like kind of look back on and see like what you were thinking and what you're going through. And I think with all these kind of methods, I think there's no one way to do it. I think everybody has to kind of figure out and experiment with what works for them. And I think that's the beauty of it all. It's like just throwing out content like, okay, try this, try this, try this, see what works, see what doesn't. You know, there's also a lot of books out there too. And I've read Don Greene is an author who's written, I think, Performance Success, Audition Success, Fight Your Fear and Win. I think I probably have some behind me. So like reading about this stuff, like understanding that like most people go through it, like, and it's okay. Like, it's just a matter of like understanding what your body's doing and trying to gain control over it as best as you can. I think there's like a negative stigma to it. Like, oh, I'm dealing with anxiety, I have stress, I have all this kind of stuff. And we kind of view you as like not being put together. And it's like quite the opposite. It's like, oh, you're human. You're actually in tune with how you feel and like your emotions. Like, that's okay. You know, so educating yourself too on this topic, I think is really beneficial, because now it's, again, it's the same thing. It's like the more you know about it, the deeper understanding you have, and say, okay, this is triggered from this. Cool. All right, I'm going to go through this routine that I go through that allows me to kind of get rid of those thoughts, those feelings, those emotions. And I'm going to exchange that with peace, with ease, you know, things of that nature.
Yeah, you crushed it. You know, I was
Oh,
going
please.
to. No, you did. You did. I agree with everything. You know, and there's a book that I remember reading. It's been a while. I think I read it either in my master's or undergrad, Intergang My Tennis.
Yep.
That's a really good book. There's a music version of it, but I prefer the original Intergang My Tennis. That talks about this kind of the same thing that we're talking about today. But yeah, like in terms of like dealing with that, it's one of those things, like performance anxiety is one of those things that there is no like pill for it. You know, it does come down to the individual. So something that works for me may not work for other people. So it's really about, you know, if this is an issue that you're having, it's definitely something that you kind of have to look in the mirror and find out your whys. Like, why is this? Is it the pressure? Is it, you know, being distracted? Is it, you know, whatever it is, it could, you know, range from a lot of different issues. But I think, like, you know, what Tyler said, in terms of like reading and doing a lot of research, you really have to just kind of figure out your whys ultimately. You know, why is this a problem? And then, you know, through meditation, breathing, and kind of go through, you know, and reaching out to other people who dealt with, you know, performance anxiety. Because I always say to my students, we are a community of people. We're all here to help each other, right? You know, I've never met a musician in my life where it's like, hey, how do you do so and so? Or, you know, what would you do for this? Like, I've never met a musician, at least not yet, not who would. I've never met a musician who was unwilling to offer like some helpful advice, especially if it's something like they've dealt with in their personal lives. So talking to other people, you know, we just had our we're in the midst of our first week of the semester here in Valdosta. So, you know, we had our first studio class at a few days ago. So, you know, I like always preface this class of like, all right, you know, we have our 15 or 16 students in the room. And I'm sorry, everyone look to your left, everyone look to your right, look in front of you, look behind you. The people in this room are the people who are going to help you get through this program. This is your support base, right? And when you're having issues, these are the people you need to go to and talk to and figure it all out. You know, we are a community ultimately. And if you're having, you know, performance anxiety, there's so many people in our field, regardless of instruments. You know, I've talked to many of my colleagues who are string players, who are, you know, pianists, you know, about performing anxiety and things that they do. You know, we all have our things, you know. You know, one quick story that I have, I remember the first time that I've ever like really dealt with performance anxiety to the point where it was like physically debilitating. I remember being I think I was in undergrad in a band rehearsal. So we were working on some piece and I had to play a solo. I think I was maybe a sophomore or junior. I think I was a sophomore. And our director asked me to play it because it was like a kind of like an on stage, off stage trumpet solo thing. So I was playing the off stage thing. So he asked me to like to play, and he stopped rehearsing. Hey, can you two guys play your solo so I can hear it? And like I remember like getting ready to play and like freaking out. And it was the first time this has ever happened to me. I'm playing and literally my right leg is shaking. Like it is like up shaking and I cannot control it. I'm trying to play while my leg is physically shaking. And I'm like, in my head, I'm thinking like, what is going on right now? So I can't focus on the music because I'm like, my leg is physically shaking. And I was like, I've never experienced this before. So that was the first time. It's like, okay, that's something new. Why did that happen?
Yeah.
So I had to ask the whys because that's not something I ever really dealt with. Because I at least I like to think I'm pretty like even keel when it comes to performances. I try not to take myself too seriously. So I think for this time, I really wanted it to be perfect because I'm playing in front of my colleagues and, you know, the director's there and there's another trumpet player who's playing his part. So I think I just, in that moment, I put so much pressure on myself for it to be like perfect. It has to be perfect at this time. And that like, it just really, you know, took me out of the music physically and mentally. So that's when I first like had to have that conversation. All right, why did this happen? And how do I deal with this if this ever happens again? Because for me, it's not something that happens consistently. It's like I don't know when it's going to happen, so I need to know how to deal with it when it does happen. So it was definitely a learning experience, and it, you know, we're always growing and we're always trying to figure out how to become better musicians and how to deal with the different various, you know, variety of things that comes our way. But you know, going back to the meditation and a lot of the things that you mentioned about, you know, talking yourself up, the self-talk, the positive self-talk, and you know, and staying in the moment is, you know, I think one of the most beneficial things that we can do in terms of dealing with performance anxiety. But it is a revolving door, I think, because what might work for you today, you know, maybe a few years down the line, you have different values or different priorities, rather. So it may manifest, the anxiety may manifest in a different way. So I think it's going to be a constant like reevaluating, you know, because I think my priorities now are very different from my priorities as an undergraduate, certainly as a high schooler or, you know, a grad student. So I think, you know, performance anxiety is definitely something I personally, you know, have to like constantly be like tweaking my approaches of how to deal with it, you know, because like I said,
We think that you think that, okay, once I figure it out or solve it, it's done. And it's not. It's like you have to practice it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this mindfulness, you have to practice it daily, or, you know, whenever a performance comes up. And that's something that kind of gets lost too, is that like, oh, if I just figure out the secret to playing high notes will be there forever. And it's like, no, you got to work on it every single day, little bits at a time. And yeah, and then it changes too, you know. It's like as you develop and grow in your career, certain performances might trigger it where others don't, you know. And then like you said too, it could become, you know, being a performer and then all of a sudden now you're a father and it's like, whoa, I got anxiety about being a father now, or this and that, you know. And it's always going to be there. Life is always going to throw you something, a curveball, whatever it is. And so like you said, the more in tune you can be with you and knowing your tendencies. I think we talked about that last week a little bit with like exercise and nutrition. Like, all right, if I know I munch a lot and like to eat snacks, then the snacks that I eat need to be beneficial for me. You know, just like the same thing. Like, okay, if I know I have a performance today, I need to do like a light warm up. I need to do this. I need to read, you know, whatever it is to set you up, go for a run. Actually, before my audition for this job, I literally woke up in the morning and went down and ran on the treadmill because I typically like to exercise before I practice. And I didn't want to stop that routine going into that audition because I'm like, my body is used to like feeling those endorphins and then going to play. And I was like, I can't change it up. So it was like 6 a.m. down in the gym running and kind of just going through that. That is a process that I take to kind of like get in the zone, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a muscle that you got to work out, and it's tough, but again, I think when you let the stigma go and be like, hey man, it's all good. This is something that everybody deals with to some degree, you know, and that it's not impossible. You can figure this out, but it will take time. If it takes 10 years, it takes 10 years. You know, if it takes a semester, it takes a semester. You know, it's different for everybody, man. But yeah, it's been something that has plagued me for a while, and it's something that I still have to go through. I mean, even in my practicing, sometimes I'll get nervous before I play something, and I'm like, why am I nervous? I'm in my home right now, like, because I'm afraid it's going to sound bad. And it's like, who cares, man? Get over it. Get over yourself. You know, it's like, doesn't matter. So with that said, man, like, what are some resources? We talked a little bit about a couple books, but are there any other things that you have? I mean, I got a few written down that I can share, but are there any, besides the Inner Game of Tennis, have you read any other books or podcasts or things of that nature that have helped you in your journey?
The Inner Game is been my primary source, other than, you know, like I said earlier, reaching out to other musicians and hearing their approach, which is kind of why I'm super excited. As Tyler mentioned earlier, the part 2 of this performance anxiety series, we're going to be talking to a therapist who specializes kind of in like mental health and dealing with anxiety. So I'm really excited to talk to her in our next episode. I think I've never talked to a professional, you know, about performance anxiety. It's always musicians. So like, you know, we're always into, you know, talking to people outside of our, you know, like I said, like we're both trumpet players. So we like to talk to people outside the trumpet community. So I'm really excited about talking to her because she may have some like great resources that I'm unaware of. But what books have you read about performance anxiety?
Yeah, so I've read Inner Game of Tennis as well. Don Greene, again, the books that I mentioned earlier, I'll spit them out again. Performance Success, Audition Success, Fight Your Fear and Win. I recently reread a book called Effortless Mastery by Kenny Werner.
Oh, yes, I know that book.
Yeah, that one was really good. Resonated with me a lot, especially with what I'm dealing with coming back from an injury and just kind of removing yourself from like the physical nature of playing your instrument, kind of taking a step back. There's also a lot of good podcasts that are out there too. Bulletproof Musician is a podcast, and they post videos. Some of them are short, like 5 or 6 minutes, but it's from like a doctor's standpoint of like, okay, if you're dealing with this, or they'll interview, like I know Tom Hooten was in one of the interviews and talked about his process. And like, I know he has his own setup and his thoughts of like how he deals with big performances. So that's a really cool podcast to check out. Let's see, Rich Roll, I'm into. He's a like endurance vegan athlete kind of guy, but he brings on a lot of professionals that deal with mental health and things of that nature, because he was actually an alcoholic. And so he had to pull himself out of that and kind of rewire his brain and his thinking. So he always brings on really great guests that kind of like stimulate and make you think a little bit differently of like, okay, how does this apply to what I do? Tim Ferriss is another person. He's kind of like, he wrote like Tools of Titans, and he's always about like interviewing top performers and kind of getting inside their head and seeing like how they do what they do. So he's another person. And then ultimately for me, man, a lot of this too comes down to like from a personal standpoint, like my faith and like reading and just like trusting that like what I do is bigger than myself. So, you know, as many resources as there are out there, you know, individually, like whether you have a religious belief or not, like I think it's important to figure out, like tap into something that is bigger than yourself. Because then, like you said, you kind of look at it and you're just like, man, this isn't like in the scope of things, this performance, yeah, it's something, but it's not everything. You know, it's like at the end of the day, I'm going to come home from that performance and I have an amazing wife. I have 2 cats. You know, it's like, it's all good.
Yeah.
The sun will rise tomorrow, you know,
absolutely.
like no worries. So
well, hopefully it rises.
Oh yeah. Well, at that point, you know,
2020 has been a trip. 2020 has been on something. So who knows?
Yeah, for real, man. So before we wrap up the podcast, what have you been checking out this week? Music wise, book, podcast related, whatever.
Yeah. So I've been kind of checking out 2 things. One, I love, I might have mentioned this last episode, but I love hip hop, R&B, just like good music, regardless of its genre. So I've been listening a lot, at least this week. I've been listening to this hip hop group I believe they're out of Brooklyn, called Phony People. I'm not sure if you know them, but
I'll have to check that out.
They're great. So if you look it up, it's like Phony it's not F, sorry, PHONY, and then they abbreviate people like PPL. So it's Phony People. Good group out of Brooklyn, hip hop, R&B, kind of fusion, jazz. Like it's kind of all in there. So I've been checking this group out. I have their album on Spotify. Great group. I love their album. They also did the NPR Tiny Desk concert. So if you want to check them out live, they're there, and it's a really good show. And I also been checking out one of my friends. He's trumpet professor at University of Central Florida, Jesse Cooks. I have he gave me his new project, his new CD called Imagine Conversations. And he's commissioned some works on that CD. But Jesse Cook is a fantastic trumpet player.
He's amazing.
Yeah.
That guy never gets tired, man.
He has chops for days.
If
he hears this, he'll probably text me and with like a LOL. But I've been checking out I've been checking out his new CD, Imagine Conversations. I also believe if you want to check it out, it's on Spotify, and it's probably on Apple or iTunes that you can purchase it there. But it's great. So I mean, I'm working through it now. But so far, like, it's definitely killing, and it's a few new works on there as well that I've never heard of. So it's a lot of cool things on there. What are you listening to?
Cool, man. So revisited some old favorites. Sean Jones. Listening to him again. Some of his older stuff, like his Roots album.
Yeah.
I remember it's interesting. You listen back to music and it kind of brings back memories of like, oh man, I remember like being in high school and like driving my car, like listening to this album. And so I've been checking him out again. And then Jacob Collier. So I guess he's had like been putting out some music bits at a time on YouTube. But yeah, his new stuff, man, it's just so, and he's kind of working with some of these pop artists, and it's, oh my gosh, it's like when he takes what he does and tones it down just a little bit to make it like pop vibey, and then incorporates like maybe 10% of what he does into it, and it's like unreal.
The best version of pop music.
Yeah, for real. Like you listen to that and you're like, oh man, this stuff is killing. Yeah, it's awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, that dude is incredible. And Sean Jones is an incredible trumpet player.
Yeah, exactly. And then I actually watched, I don't know if you've heard of this, it's called The Weight of Gold. It's a documentary that HBO just came out with, interviewing, ironically, Olympic athletes and about the mental health issues that they face. So if you have access to HBO or can do a trial, I highly recommend it. I think the documentary is like an hour, and Michael Phelps is the narrator, but it goes in a deep dive into all these athletes that you recognize from the games, and it talks about how their mental health is just in the pits and how like what happens after they're done, you know, because their career has a timestamp, you know, it's only for X amount of years, and then they're like, what do I do? And they're not set up for success and how to go from Olympic athletes to just like almost like civilians. They call it like going back into the civilian world. So it's really interesting to see like what they deal with and how it's like they trained 4 years for like one moment, you know, which is like hard to fathom. It's like, could you imagine working 4 years for just one audition?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in some regards, we do that because we practice every day and we do those things for those moments. But like for them, it's like they drop everything, you know. They talk about financially how like they only make like a couple $1,000 a month that they have to live off of. And it's just a lot of those athletes come out in debt, and it's interesting. So the Weight of Gold, recommend checking that out.
So I think what we'll do is, since we named a lot of resources in this episode, perhaps we can put these in our description box so people can
put those in the show notes.
We'll add that so you can have access, or because I know we've been naming a lot of different things, so we'll put it in the description box, and then you can look it up for yourself or check it out for yourself. Do you have anything else? Are you done with your cup of coffee?
I am, man. I am, and yeah.
Well, good. So am I. So we want to thank you guys again for listening to another episode of Coffee and Clarks. And again, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. Next time, we're going to do another deep dive into performance anxiety because we think it's so important. And we're going to have a friend of mine who's a therapist, and she's going to give us her perspective of like what performance anxiety is, how to deal with it, or any other tidbits she wants to offer us. So we're really excited about having her on our next episode. And in the meantime, please subscribe to our YouTube account and Instagram account and Facebook at Coffee and Clarks. Subscribe and, give us 5 stars only if you're worth it. If you think, we're worth it, no pressure.
We're also on Apple Podcasts too.
So check us out on Apple Podcasts. Subscribe and give us 5 stars. Tyler, where can we find your personal account on social media?
Yeah, so Facebook, just type in my name, Tyler Duncan, and then Instagram, Tyler Duncan 91. I went back and looked. There is no W in there. So.
I think that's your email. Yeah, that's your email.
It is my email, yeah. Oh, now they know.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Oops. You can find me on Instagram at nerdyprof. And on Facebook, just my name, JVN Brabham. And I think that's it. Yeah. Instagram and Facebook. Yeah. So check us out, and we will be having part 2 of this series very soon, hopefully within a week or so. But thank you guys again, and thank you for having a cup of coffee with us.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.